distances. So thank you very much for that. We very much value your time. All right, with that, we will move into our panel. So I would welcome the panelists to join us, turn on their video and turn on their audio here on the screen. Once again, I will note that I am Michael Daniel, the President and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, one of the sponsors for this conference, along with the Cybersecurity Coalition. Just as one reminder, these sessions are being recorded and will be available on YouTube after the conference ends. You can find the link on the conference website. So I'm very happy to moderate this panel on how to better combat cybercrime. We've got a real rock star lineup here. We've got Mieke Eoyang from Third Way. We've got Kristin Judge from the Cybercrime Support Network. We've got Megan Stifel from the Global Cyber Alliance, one of the other alliances in the constellation of alliances. And we have Herb Stapleton from the FBI. So as I mentioned in my opening, cyber threats, of course, are manifest in real life. And one of the main ways that happens for most people, in fact, is through cybercrime. And this problem has been growing for years now, and it is starting to impose significant costs on the digital economy. And so we really need to begin to tackle this problem in some different ways. So we're going to leap right into some questions for the panelists. But of course, feel free to enter your questions from the audience into the Q&A box. And we will try to address those that are not trolling us. Mieke, I'll actually start with you, since Third Way, recently released a report on this topic. Nation state activity is the one that tends to get all of the headlines, but cybercrime, for most people, most organizations in the world, cybercrime is actually a much bigger problem. So can you talk a little bit more about the big picture of the effect of cybercrime on the digital economy based on the work that Third Way has done, and talk a little bit about the initiative that you've just put out?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And thank you so much for inviting me to talk about the subject. We think that we have been, this problem has been bubbling underneath the surface for a long time as we focused on the nation state actors. But as you say, it is the thing that most Americans are actually experiencing. We've done survey work and others have done survey work that indicate that as many as 1 in 4 Americans have been victimized by cybercrime, which would make it the most prevalent form of crime in America. And I don't mean just like, their identity was taken in an Equifax hack or something like that. We're talking about real financial impacts for people, their identity being stolen and being used for things, their loss of money, false charges, and worse and potentially even deadly, as we've seen, ransomware attacks. There have been different estimates of the magnitude of this problem, as high as $1 trillion, though it may be more, because over these COVID times, we've seen a real uptick in cybercrime, especially in ransomware attacks. Criminals are also working from home. So we see a real challenge here in the numbers. And then the other thing is that we don't really have good statistics because we think that cybercrime is underreported. The FBI has their IC3 database, which is very important for people to report in. They get about 350,000 reports in an average year. I'm sure it'll be up this year. But that is a factor of, that undercount represents a factor of 100 off of what people are really experiencing if the polling numbers are to be believed in terms of its impact on Americans. On the flip side of that, we think that these crimes are very hard to prosecute. And are under-prosecuted in part because of the underreporting, but in part because of the difficulty of the fact that the victim and the criminal are often in different nations. And so how do you investigate and figure this out, especially as criminals are taking steps, technological steps to hide their identities and the activities that they engage in. But we did an assessment and we've seen that it could be as low as 3 in 1,000 reported cyber incidents, see an arrest, which would make it the lowest enforcement rate of all the kinds of crime that we have in America. And look, I don't blame law enforcement for this. This is an evolving area of crime, but it's certainly something that we need to get a handle on. And so we have had an initiative for the past few years to look at recommendations that we can make to help law enforcement do a better job of getting after that cyber criminal, and looking at the resourcing that they have, looking at identifying some of the challenges that they face in interagency and international cooperation, and have put together a list of recommendations, which we released I think this week, Monday.
It's hard to keep track. Yeah,
it is hard to keep track in these work from home times, with nearly 60 recommendations of what the next administration can do to start to get a handle on this problem and be able to move forward. And I don't want to take all the time, but I'm happy to get into the specific areas that we address in that report and the challenges that we've seen with this group of experts that we brought together to put together a plan.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there too. Thank you for all the work that Third Way does on this program. And I was fortunate enough to be a part of the law enforcement personnel and capacity working group. And every time I read more of what comes out from Third Way, I feel like it is really our research arm in a way, because you're proving the concept for why Cybercrime Support Network exists. And one of the recommendations or objectives in the Third Way report that came out was to identify and clarify the roles and responsibilities for cybercrime investigations among all of law enforcement, federal, state, and local. There still is some confusion there. And I think that will make a huge difference once we get that figured out. But for me, developing uniform metrics to inform and improve data reporting. We need to have more reports so that Congress knows what's actually happening. We need to understand the economic impact that cybercrime is having on Main Street, on people's retirement savings, their ability to go to school or pay their medical bills. This is an economic issue, not just a crime and prosecution issue. We need to start thinking of it as an economic issue. And the victim response, that's something that's truly lacking here, that CSN is in business to serve and help us. We need to start serving individuals and small businesses, because collecting the data is important, yes, and going after the perpetrators is important, yes, but we still have 50 million potential people that are not being served after they've been a victim of crime. And in this country, that needs to be addressed.
Yes, thank you, Mieke and Kristin, for that overview. I want to poke at this, this reporting issue, and I think because some of that is, I think there's a couple of factors behind that. I mean, one of them is certainly, cybersecurity is too hard. I certainly hear that from leaders, like, I can't understand what those nerds are saying. There's another one, which is it's just, everyone gets hacked. So, what's the point of investing in cybersecurity? What's the point of reporting it? And so Megan and Kristin in particular, from the Global Cyber Alliance and from the Cybercrime Support Network, how would you address those kinds of sentiments?
Thanks, Michael. Thanks to CTA and the coalition for organizing this again this year. I'm sorry that we aren't all together in DC to
in that fabulous glass room that Venable has. So.
Yes.
So
yes, to convene and to console a little bit each other, but mostly to support each other and share information. So I think I would challenge it, and I think we all do a good job of saying it maybe seem too hard or too complex, but really what I think we need to do is to empower people to recognize that you don't have to eat the whole elephant at one time. You can consume it bit by bit. And the challenge on us, those of us in this space, whether we are technologists, policy advocates, or members of academia or elected officials, is to reduce the hype and give people bite-sized elements that they can act on, whether they be quite capable or mature actors. They will have larger budgets and have access to potentially more complex resources at the lower end, and where I think, as Mieke gave the overview and Kristin alluded to, helping users understand that they are not powerless in this space. There are things that they can do. There are resources out there that are digestible. And for our organization, I think most folks know that we offer 3 toolkits to help small businesses, elections officials, and journalists try to better secure and implement cyber hygiene that Marina alluded to a few minutes ago. But really to simplify and support each other in taking action as opposed to, the absence of action is in fact action itself, right? So let's take action, which is what I would urge others to answer your question.
Yes, I started my career educating elected officials on their role in cybersecurity in 2009. So you can imagine having conversations with the typical elected official who's probably not skilled in technology, and telling them, some of them that didn't even use email at the time because they didn't understand the technology, that they had a role to play in cybersecurity. And I think when you talk about company leaders, they're no different than, state and local leaders that are in a position. They're not technologists, but what we try and tell them is you don't have to become fluent in cybersecurity, because many of them would just say to me behind closed doors, well, I don't want to look stupid. Can you tell me some questions to ask my CISO? Because they're supposed to be the leader. They're supposed to really know a little bit about everything. We have to give these leaders the permission not to know a lot about security and say, look, you don't know a lot about accounting necessarily, but you bring in really good accountants. So just listen to the people that you've brought into your organization and give them the time in the room, give them a seat at the board table, and then think about policy and budgets. That's the impact any leader has on the security posture of their organization. And you understand policy and you understand budgets, that's your job, we tell the leaders, but just bring in that key set of stakeholders that understand this issue. You don't have to become an expert on it yourself. And so sometimes I think people just sort of freeze and put their head in the sand because they don't feel like they can be confident about the issue. So give yourself some leeway there. You don't have to be confident, just surround yourself with people who understand and take the time to listen to them.
No, I think that's those are both really good points. And that's actually something that I try to drive home too, which is that the other issue, to Megan's point about not having to eat the whole elephant, just because you can't stop everything doesn't mean you can't stop a lot of things, right? And we all know that some of the basics, like turning on multi-factor authentication and using a password manager, would really cut down on a lot of cyber criminal activity. And so some of it is just, you don't always have to have, a shiny, snort flabulator to put on your network to actually, make improvements. So let me actually turn to the law enforcement side, since we've got somebody from the FBI here. Law enforcement agencies around the world have recognized the need to fight cybercrime. We've just seen the World Economic Forum release the Partnership Against Cybercrime report. And, we know that cybercrime poses some different challenges from crime in the physical world. Mieke alluded to the fact that the victim can be in one country and the perpetrator can be, all around the world. So how is the FBI, Herb, positioning itself to more effectively address cybercrime, and how is it working with the private sector to address some of these challenges?
Hey, Michael, thanks very much for having me on today. I really appreciate the opportunity to try to represent the law enforcement perspective as best I can. In the FBI, cyber activity, cybersecurity in general has become an extremely high priority over the past number of years. And cyber criminal activity in particular is of an especial focus given just sort of what's going on in the country right now. When we look at cybercrime from the FBI perspective, we think one of the advantages that the FBI has in this space is that we have both counterintelligence and federal criminal law authorities. So that puts us in a position where we can impose risk and consequence both on nation state actors who are responsible for this activity, as well as the transnational organized criminal groups that have been discussed already here in this particular forum. I think one really important thing for the FBI is that we have become convinced, over the course of the past few years, as we try to fight this particular threat, that it's not the kind of thing that the FBI can do alone, that really any one government agency or private sector entity can do all by itself. And so, we have sort of redoubled our efforts to reach out to state and local authorities who can be our partners in this fight, to other federal agencies who can be our partners in this fight, as well as to private sector entities. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. There are far too many to list here in this particular forum, but I would just hold up our partnership with the National Cyber Forensics and Training Alliance, the NCFTA, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as one example of our efforts to have really, operational partnerships with the private sector, not just mere information exchanges, but the near real-time exchange of intelligence that allows either the FBI or its government partners, or even private sector partners to actually take real action against the threat as soon as possible. Another recent example of that type of effort that we have stood up is the National Defense Cyber Alliance, which is a 501c3 that the FBI has partnered with in an effort to foster real-time intelligence sharing with cleared defense contractors, who obviously are a major target for this type of cyber threat activity. So, I think, like I said, I could probably spend hours talking about that, but I think that is, as we move forward, the most important thing that we can do is to continue to leverage our authorities to the full extent that we can, but also find ways to facilitate the operations of our government partners, our foreign partners, and our partners in the private sector to have that maximum impact against the threat.
Yeah, thanks, Herb. So, Mieke, if we come back around to some of the recommendations that your report is making, if you wanted to pull out one or two for this panel to kind of talk about, what would you pull out from that report?
Yeah, so a few key recommendations that we've got in here. Number one, Michael, you'll appreciate hearing this. We think we need to reinstate a White House coordinator to coordinate activity across all the different agencies. As Herb mentioned, FBI can't do this alone. There are aspects here that the State Department has to take on, that the intelligence agencies have to take on. But as they work in their own little silos, we need someone at the White House who can coordinate all that activity to make sure that we're actually getting to human attribution and being able to bring cases against these individuals, working on extraditions, working on bringing pressure to bear on other countries to turn people over to us. We won't be able to do that if we don't have a quarterback running the effort. So that's one of the big recommendations that we have in there. And that, cybercrime is part of that person's job, that it's not just defensively focused. The other big key, and Kristin talked about this, is a better effort to gather the data on cybercrime. We know anecdotally that about some of the different kinds of victims that we have in the defense industry, certainly from a nation state perspective, is one of the biggest victims. But we're hearing with COVID that we're seeing ransomware attacks against hospitals that have real impacts on people's lives. We're hearing from the tech community that mid-stage companies that don't have the infrastructure on security are getting hit with ransomware in ways that really endanger American ability to innovate and grow our economy going forward. We need to have better data on what kinds of attacks are happening. The Bureau of Justice Statistics did a great survey on this in 2005, but we haven't seen that kind of survey repeated, even as we know that cybercrime efforts have grown. So we have a really big push in there on data. And then the third big recommendation that I'd highlight for this is our efforts on the international, on assessing internationally which countries are best, where we get the best bang for our buck and working with them, and building up capacity and measuring our capacity building efforts so that when Herb picks up the phone and calls someone in Romania or calls someone in Nigeria, the people on the other end of the phone know what to do and help to assist the FBI in their investigations. And we think that that's a huge part of making a dent in this problem.
Great. Well, thank you, Mieke. Yeah, I sort of continuing along that theme, and for anyone to sort of jump in on, how do we actually, it's very easy to talk about public-private partnership, right? And, that term can start to sound like, synergy or other things that, like, we say it so often, we don't actually know what it means anymore. but can we talk about some of the actual like brass tacks, like how do we actually do this? What are the policies we should put in place? What are the organizational, like how do we actually make that public-private partnership between law enforcement and other government agencies in the private sector and the non, civil society actually work? I'll let anybody sort of jump on that one.
Well, I can start with that. We're already doing that at CSN. We are a public-private partnership. I know it's an overused term, but we have private sector companies that have donated millions of dollars to work with us. And then we have our funding from CISA, where we're building out a foundational system so that we can practice getting more people to report. We're talking about small businesses and consumers, and then do a push out of information sharing to state and local government. So we're going to be participating with fusion centers in 5 states to get information out to them when we see consumers and small business threats. And we had these working groups put together over the past year during the first year of our cooperative agreement. And we had Secret Service, DHS, FBI, we had Google and other companies sitting right there together talking about how are we going to share information when we see what's happening to consumers and small businesses. So we're living it, and it is happening in test phase. We're in proof of concept, obviously, then the brass tacks really hits when it becomes more formalized. But the people that we work with on the private sector side, they know their responsibility in helping us. We work with the Microsoft team who just helped take down TrickBot. There's a lot of work happening on the private sector where they're cooperating with public. And we hope to make sure that that's exactly what we do and what we represent at CSN.
Michael, just to build, go ahead.
Go ahead, Megan.
I think larger scale efforts are important. And so the work that CSN is doing, as Kristin just alluded to, is critical. There are, I think, though, several other components and pieces that are critical to advancing and reducing cybercrime. And it sounds also like something we don't know what to do anymore about, to use the phrase trust and responsibility. But I do think at the less public level, we continue to struggle with, but we do have good success in making small dents in building trust in the community, in I think less broad information sharing opportunities and having real impact. So I think we've talked about TrickBot, but there are a number of other successes that the community has scored over the past few years. Perhaps they didn't evolve as quickly as some might like, and perhaps losses could have been prevented through, among other things, back to the hygiene piece of this. But I do think we need to focus on continuing to build trust in some of our key stakeholder organizations, but also to accept responsibility for the roles that we all play in this space. And so looking for opportunities to step up and accept responsibility, whether it be through small level engagements or higher level work. And that's not just on the post-crime end, right? We haven't talked about it, and that's not the topic of discussion for this panel, around other areas in the ecosystem where we can have scale to try and reduce the impact of cybercrime, things like using protective DNS services and some of the resources that have been alluded to around multi-factor authentication, looking at enhancing the security of email, some of the things that GCA works on. But those are the sort of softer side of things that nonetheless, I think are really critical to actually getting data around. We can develop all of the widgets that we want. I forget the Michael phrase that you used a few minutes ago. I can't remember what it was, but at the end of the day, if we don't trust that the data is going to be actually actualized, or we don't trust that someone is going to use it for the intended purpose, we're done.
Yeah. To follow up on Megan's point on trust, I think one of the challenges that we really see in the public-private cooperation, and this is why we call for a clarification of roles and responsibilities, is that a lot of this is very relational. And the particular interest of someone in law enforcement, or the particular capabilities of someone in law enforcement, really can drive a lot of the response from the private sector. And they go looking for someone who is receptive and creating a good relationship. They build up trust with that individual. But then that individual either gets, retires, gets hired away to the private sector, rotates into another assignment, and then we're building again from scratch. But if the roles and responsibilities were more formalized, if people in the private sector knew who to call as an institutional matter, and those institutions were building trust with the private sector, I think it would go a long way to helping people know who they should be calling when these kinds of things are happening, as opposed to having it so personalized and relational. And yes, at the end of the day, trust is relational, but we need to think about it more than just personality driven.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that if you look at the Partnership Against Cybercrime report that came out from the WEF, one of the concepts that's in there is this idea that it's not just about arrest and prosecution, that's too narrow of a lens to look at this problem. That is obviously the gold standard, right? And seeing the perp walk in cuffs, that's great. But unfortunately, we all know that that's not going to happen a lot of the time, at least not immediately, because many of these criminals live in countries that either willingly harbor them or are incapable of dealing with them. So we also need to look at other ways to disrupt the criminal ecosystem and to bring together the capabilities of the private sector to do that along with the public sector. So maybe Herb, I can start with you, but I want to hear from all the panelists about how should we be thinking about that broader disruption effort? And I think this goes with the FBI strategy that you've released to actually think about broadening that aperture.
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to talk about that a little bit. I think that every case is going to be a little different. Like every set of this is a very fact dependent type of enterprise. And so what we have to figure out along the way, working with our partners, is what is most likely to have the biggest disruptive effect. And so we have to weigh those and balance those factors that tell us, is it worthwhile to just to kind of give a hypothetical situation, is it worthwhile to wait to try to gain more real world attribution on a particular actor because we think we might be able to extradite and arrest that person? Or are we in a better position to utilize governmental authorities to for example, seize illicit proceeds, knowing that if we do that seizure, we may never actually get to, or at least not on this round, get to real world attribution of that particular actor? Or is the third option, is there infrastructure, activities that can be undertaken either by the government or by those who hold that type of infrastructure in the private sector that we can use to disrupt operations, temporarily? That would be a better, or is it all of the above? And so those are the things that we want to, the kind of inquiry that we want to undertake in every cyber criminal investigation of significance. And I think that raises another really important question that has really never been confronted until very recently, at least certainly not in a conversation between the government and the private sector, is what really are our priorities? Like we name a lot of things, cyber and cybercrime, but that's not sort of a monolithic type of concept. A ransomware is a different thing from a BEC, is a different thing from a from sort of a typical kind of social engineering type of fraud. And so a lot of those things often get sort of thrust into the cybercrime kind of overarching category. But I think it's also important for us to talk about, what are our priorities, particularly from the federal government standpoint. So for us, a priority over the past year or so has been ransomware. And I think that that work has been, we probably chose that emphasis before it even really grew to what it is today. But I think that choice has proven itself to be the right one, at least as far as measuring the threats to the United States and its infrastructure from a cybercrime threat standpoint. So that's what I would say. I mean, I think it really just starts with an open conversation and an effort to really understand what the capabilities are across the board.
Yeah, and thanks for that. And I think as I think about the experience that we have with CTA and what we've seen, I think one of the big challenges that we will start to face is how do we actually synchronize operations, right? We've actually spent a lot of our time talking about information sharing, and we still haven't quite gotten that down yet. But we made a lot of progress in that score. And now what we actually realize that we're needing to start doing is actually synchronizing operations so that, government action from what law enforcement can do, from what Justice Department can do, can be synchronized with what private sector cybersecurity firms could do, or what ISPs could do, or what Microsoft could do using legal channels, and use that to amplify and increase the impact. But Mieke, Kristin, Megan, any other thoughts on this question about sort of this widening this aperture beyond sort of arrest and prosecution, this disruption concept?
Yeah, I think Herb touched on this briefly, but when we talk about the point of the illicit proceeds, I think that there can be more effort placed on that piece of it. Cryptocurrency obviously plays a huge role in ransomware and in cybercrime generally, so that cybercriminals can move money around the globe without triggering money laundering red flags. I think the tech community is trying to work on some of these things on how we can make AML compliant cryptocurrencies or things like that. And how do we think about using that? How do we track Bitcoin wallets and the other things so that we can try and figure out who owns what and how to get to people at that point where they are converting cryptocurrency into actual money, and trying to disrupt that way. Because if we can make it less profitable for the criminals, then they may choose to do other kinds of things. But that's a place where public-private cooperation and coordination could really help.
Yeah, we need more reports in. So if we have a national database where people can call and get some kind of a response back, and we can start seeing what's happening in the ransomware that's happening to small and medium organizations, then we just can potentially reduce the profit margins. If you don't reduce the profit margins for the criminals, it's not going to go away at the end of the day.
I think just to add another piece of this onto the conversation, for many of the vulnerable entities in the ecosystem, there is not enough support. So again, if we can look to the left of the crime as opposed to the right of the crime, in addition to looking to the right of the crime, how can we, together with members of the coalition and elsewhere, push resources out to those vulnerable entities so that they don't become victims in the first instance, or that the victimization is not as significant as it might have been. So I do think that there's a lot of pressure actually that's going to be placed on some of these key vulnerable communities in the upcoming years as we continue to see, for example, the longer we stay in lockdowns in various states, the less we have an opportunity to generate income for states, which means that their budgets are going to be further constrained, which unfortunately then puts additional stress and opportunity on all parts of the ecosystem, ultimately leading to, unfortunately, maybe more cybercrime. So I think there are, while it's easy to say, well, Congress should just appropriate more money, I do think that there's actually also an opportunity here for industry to collaborate with organizations like those that are in front of us, to make some of the resources that they have more available, even if it's for a briefer period of time. There's an opportunity there. I think too, not to make this too much of a pitch, but we know that there's more than enough cybercrime to go around. So while it's important for there to be paid services available, it's also important for there to be free services available for those who cannot afford them themselves. So I would urge industry to look at opportunities to partner with these smaller organizations, and particularly in civil society, to get the resources into the hands of people who need them the most.
Yeah, and Michael, if I could just add one more thing on the private public-private cooperation, which is, and we hear this repeatedly, private sector is more than willing to share in many cases with the government information that they see about the crimes and the signatures of the people who are attacking them. I come out of the intel space, and one of the challenges that we see is that it's often a one-way sharing. Information goes into the government, but information does not come back out of from the government to help people understand what they need to be doing. And so we need to rethink how we feel about and how the government handles information that comes in from the private sector and what they can share out, because the one-way sharing also undermines the sense of trust that the private sector has about what the government is up to. And if there was more sharing back, that helps build that trust relationship.
Hey, Michael, if I could, I'd like to address that just briefly, because I think that's a really important point, and that is traditionally a sort of obstacle that we've struggled with. And so I would say that overall, the FBI's position now is to foster an environment where increased sharing is possible. Sometimes we're constrained by legalities, right? I mean, there are times when, because of the sources or the methods that we used to obtain the information in the first place, then it can't be shared back out. Or sometimes there are true operational equities. In other words, we're nearing an opportunity to make an arrest or some other operational opportunity, and to share information out would potentially jeopardize that opportunity. However, what we don't want is what I think has in the past at least been perceived as a culture of not sharing. So that's why we've set up these, the entities that I spoke to earlier. Those are two-way sharing arrangements, and that's not the only way that the government will share information. We in the FBI we publish pins and flashes. We have really increased the tempo at which we have shared indicators of compromise in tandem with our partners at DHS and at other sector-specific agencies that have a concern. So I think that's something that, at least here, I can't speak for the whole U.S. government, but I can speak for the FBI on this one. That is something that we're sensitive to and have taken great efforts to try to make this more of a two-way arrangement going forward. But we can and will continue to do better on that front.
Yes, and I mean, I think you can see very much that shift that's been going on inside the U.S. government, and I think that it's been very important to note actually that even the way that the pins, the flashes, the jars, all the different acronym soup of those things, the quality of them has changed too over the last 6 or 7 years. They're more actionable. They are different now than they were. They're not just lists of IOCs anymore. And I think that's that's a really key point, that the cybersecurity industry is awash in indicators. We have plenty of indicators. The technical indicators are not what we need from the government. What we need is the context. These are the indicators you should care about because they're actually associated with this, annoying cyber criminal group or the Lazarus group or whatever. And so I think we've made some excellent progress there that I definitely want to see us continue building on. We've mentioned ransomware, and I feel like we ought to, dig into that a little bit more, because that is really becoming a scourge across the internet. And it's also one interesting place where I think the public interest and the private interest diverge very substantially, because it is very much in the public interest, right, for no one to pay ransoms. But it is very much in the interest of many organizations to just pay the ransom and get on with things, right? That the ransomware is now not just about extorting money, but it's interrupting processes, it's potentially holding people at risk. And so how should we think about squaring up this divergence between the public interest and the private interests, and how should we begin to think about this this problem of ransomware from a public policy standpoint? I'll just toss that grenade out there on the table, and see who wants to jump on that.
I can go first because I think there's been the course of the past 2 or 3 years, there's been some sort of a bit of coverage about what is the FBI's position related to paying ransoms, and there have been, I think, some conflicting stories about what is actually the FBI's position. So maybe I could just start by articulating it and kind of, unfortunately, we haven't solved the issue, I don't think, but I can maybe start by articulating the problem from our perspective. Paying the ransom, I think, from our perspective, is a bad idea for all the reasons that you just said, Michael. It's it fuels further criminal activity. It funds other types of cyber criminal activity. It is bad for society in the long run. I think someone earlier in the panel mentioned that the reason this continues to happen is because it's profitable, right? So at the end of the day, that's what fuels the threat itself, is the fact that people still pay. And so, from a law enforcement agency perspective, I think our position has to be that that we do not recommend paying the ransom. I think the FBI would just be sort of remiss in the execution of its law enforcement duties if it said anything else, and said it earnestly. Like that's the state that we would prefer, is to see that no ransom was ever paid. That being said, we are not so unrealistic that we don't recognize the position, the realistic position that puts businesses in, particularly small and medium-sized businesses. And so I think that there was sort of a misconception that if you're going to pay the ransom, then you shouldn't work with law enforcement. And I think that in part because of the public statements that the FBI made about not paying the ransom. And I certainly don't see that to be the case. Like, you haven't committed a crime if you pay a ransom, and your information and your evidence as a victim of a crime could still be very valuable to the investigation. And the FBI will continue to treat you as a victim, because that's what you are. Even if you pay the ransom, you're still a victim of a crime. And so that's kind of how we see it. Now, I think there's been a little bit of a shift, or maybe a wrench thrown in those works by the recent OFAC advisory related to potential ransomware payments to sanctioned entities. But that doesn't really change the FBI's position, and I can't really speak for Treasury on that front, but I think, that's something that we're going to have to grapple with going forward, is what does it mean? Like, how certain are we that do we have to be that a sanctioned entity is receiving a ransomware payment before that becomes something that is off limits? The last thing I'll say is, one side benefit of that has been that the fact that Treasury has put into their materials on that contacting law enforcement is essentially considered to be, a mitigating factor in favor of an entity that, as the analysis goes forward, and whether or not they have made an illegal payment under the OFAC sanctions, that's been beneficial to us in the sense that we have received what we believe to be a higher percentage of reporting on ransomware cases than we did prior to that OFAC. But we'd have to I think the jury is still out as to how that is really affecting the payment or non-payment of ransomware payments from victims.
If I could jump in here too, I want to just point out for a second, if you're in Israel, Australia, the UK, Singapore, and you and your small company have been a victim of ransomware, you can call a number that's 24/7 Security Operations Center, and they can help you triage that event. So you may not have to pay the ransom. If you have trained people from the federal government ready to answer the call, we don't have that system in the US. So, we love to work with our FBI partners, but there's no way they can take the calls at FBI field offices for every small business that has a $10,000 ransomware attack that they're dealing with right now in real time. And they probably don't have cyber risk insurance. They can't afford to call Mandiant or FireEye to help them triage it. So we have to have something in the US that services these victims and doesn't overwhelm law enforcement. Certainly, if someone is in the middle of a ransomware attack and they're small business and they don't get any help because they can't afford to hire a specialist, and there's no government services for them to help, they may lose their business. And so we are behind here in the US. We need to start having a national program that, we're building the feasibility study for with CISA and the functionality report for, but there has to be a number to call in the US where there's trained officials that can help people triage what's happening to them, because that doesn't exist right now, and we're not going to get a handle on it. And you can't tell someone don't pay or do pay, and they need to be having their hand held a little bit. Someone's got to be there by their side, and that's where I think we have a huge gaping hole right now, which is not the fault of law enforcement. They don't have the bodies or the staffing to deal with the enormity of this project.
Yeah, I agree with Kristin. I think the government needs to have more proactive resources available to victims. And I would suspect that when OFAC put out that guidance, they just don't have a sense of the magnitude of the problem that they're dealing with, because one of the things that they say in there is that they might be able to get people a waiver in order to be able to pay so that they will not be legally held liable of a sanctions violation. Well, the government knows, as Michael was saying earlier, some of the indicators that are in fact linked to sanctioned entities. So could Treasury fast track some of those waivers so that if people come in and say, these are the indicators I have, they can say, yep, we know these are sanctioned entities, and we appreciate you telling us, and here's your waiver to be able to pay. Because it's not just about businesses going under. What we've seen recently is hospitals getting attacked with ransomware. And a hospital cannot afford to be down long enough to go through the bureaucratic process of seeking a Treasury waiver when they're talking about having to divert critical care patients to other hospitals, or shutting down surgeries, or shutting down patient medical records, and lives are actually on the line here when a hospital goes down for ransomware. And we've seen an increase in those kinds of attacks. We were hoping that people, that hackers would have some kind of ethical code, and there was talk about that earlier during COVID. But we've seen hackers attacking these kinds of facilities, and we think it's important that the FBI is getting reporting, but what is their ability when they receive this report to sort of sit on the line and hold the victim's hand through payment in a way that would enable law enforcement to be able to better attribute and catch the people who are doing this. And we have that in the sort of real life kidnapping context, where you see, we all have seen those scenes in movies of the FBI sitting there as their kidnappers call into the victims. We don't have that equivalent in the digital instance. And how do we build up that capability so that people can help respond and not just receive a complaint, receive a report and then not actually get information later about where the FBI is on its investigation, or DOJ and its prosecution of those individuals. There's a loop closing, confidence building measure that needs to happen as well for the victims.
When you need one place for the victims to go, and they need to know where that is so that we can all work together. Go ahead, Megan.
I think it's also, as we're gathering more information about the unfortunate victimization of a number of entities through ransomware, it's also important that data help inform prevention opportunities as well. So to the extent that we can kind of work our way up the ransomware kill chain and look at these different points in the ecosystem where we may be able, again, to look at whether we can scale resources to try and, as Michael pointed out, when we were preparing for this panel, telling everybody to back up their stuff is only useful to certain types of entities. It may not help everyone, and so we don't want to oversimplify that as a solution. But it can help in some cases. And so again, kind of coming back to how can we also learn in the prevention piece of this, as opposed to not, in addition to, I should say, the what do we do when it happens? Let's try to make less of it happen.
Absolutely.
And so, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we definitely want less of it to happen.
Yeah, so I mean, how can we, again, this is an opportunity to kind of expand the aperture of the partners with whom we work, and thinking about public-private partnerships to see where some of this data can support risk reduction. So.
And that's where we hope that some of our data that we're going to be able to bring in could be shared with groups like CTA and GCA to say, okay, look, what are we seeing? Because we just literally don't have view into what's happening to consumers and small business in the US. There's probably 50 million people impacted a year, and we're seeing about 1 million. So if we have that bigger picture and we can give that data to the experts at GCA and CTA and the ISAC community, then I think we actually can start understanding a little bit more of what's happening.
Well, we are almost out of time for this panel. It has been a really great discussion. So we're going to finish out with a lightning round. Your 30-second version of what you would want people to take away from the discussion today. So I will pick on Megan to go first, and then we'll just go around.
Thanks, Michael. First, again, thanks for pulling this together. I think that the biggest thing I would ask folks to take away from this is we need to gather information about the victims of crime. Let's look at also preventing crime and looking at different ways that members of the coalition, CTA partners, GCA partners, CSN participants and supporters, together with the great work that Third Way has done, can in some ways look to new opportunities to build trust and take responsibility and push those opportunities and those capabilities where appropriate down. I know we often talk about bringing this away from the consumer, but if we can talk to them about some of the small steps that they can take, as to the point that you made, Michael, those small steps can actually add up to a large, significant risk reduction piece. So more togetherness and more trust building exercises would be one of the requests I would have. Thanks again.
Excellent. Thanks, Megan. Herb, your 30-second version. Take away.
Back up your stuff. No, I think for us, and I really appreciate the perspectives of the three ladies who joined me on the panel here today. It's always valuable for me to hear that, especially from people outside the government. So I think for the FBI, the takeaway is that we recognize that cyber is a team sport. That's the way that we're going to kind of crack this thing. And, we're open to any possible solution. We're always open to hearing those things. And I can assure you that, cyber is one of the, cybercrime in particular is one of the top 3 priorities of the FBI right now. And so as a result, we're going to continue to put resources, effort, and, the unique authorities and world-class capabilities of the FBI toward trying to defeat that.
Great. Thank you, Herb. Kristin.
And we do feel that at CSN, the FBI is really, all in on supporting the victims and trying to figure out the way to move forward. So we appreciate all the partnerships that you do make. So I would say to folks, if you're interested in any of these topics, read the Cyberspace Solarium Commission recommendations. Don't forget the annex where they have legislation called the Cybercrime Victim Support Act written out. Read the Third Way documents, read the documents that Michael and some of us here helped with the World Economic Forum, and then go to talk to policymakers and advocate for some solutions. So we all have a voice, and together, if we're sort of, marching to the same goals here, like you can see in the Third Way, it's very clearly written. Anybody can pick up an objective that they care about and start talking to people. We talk to congressional leaders all the time at CSN, letting them know there are victims out here, there are solutions, and that we want to be a part of the solution. So use your voice. I think it's time. We have a new administration that's going to be there to listen. And it's time that we advocate for these solutions.
Great. Absolutely. Definitely be engaged. All right, Mieke, take us home.
Well, thank you. And thanks for doing this. Again, look, I think the big takeaways here are cybercrime is a big and growing problem, but there's not a silver bullet solution. It's many, many steps that we need to take, and we need to take them together, and people should feel empowered to be able to take those steps and recognize that every little thing that we do is going to help this problem. And you don't have to feel like just because the problem is so mammoth that we can't make a dent in it. All of us have a piece of this, and working together, we can actually make the problem better. And I think overcoming the futility is the biggest thing that I would urge people to take away from this conversation. There's a lot that we can do. We just have to be committed to keep doing it.
Excellent. That's a great note to end on. I want to thank all of the panelists, Megan, Mieke, Kristin, and Herb, for joining us today for this really great conversation. So thank you very much. Thank you for all your input.
Thank you.
We will now take a short 10-minute